I'm Cameron. I classmates with Dan and Russell. Thanks for whoever's put this on. It's nice, like your last one. But, yeah, so I'm a digital composition and performance student. Basically, what we do is we're not really programmers, but we kind of think we are. So we have musical backgrounds, and we just try to use computers and programs to really add more, to broaden our toolkit, and yeah, and just work as composers with these new tools. So what I'm going to talk about are a few things that I've learned this year, and a lot of that has to do with the real-time performance environment. I call it the real-time scene, and I think the idea of composing metaphors and overcoming the difficulties of perception and working with software in a performance environment setting, and yeah, hopefully I can illustrate that for you a little bit. So overview, I want to talk about the real-time scene, why I call it the scene, where that name has kind of been derived from, and pretty much how we composers kind of think about the real-time performance environment. And liveness and interaction, how do you integrate a computer to this? How do you generate a performance action? How do you manipulate that and use it to extract more meaning? And creative biases, like how you can take this network of your real-time system and make it ecological, make it biased in a creative way to amplify your data, shape your data so it can act as a metaphor. All right, creative freedom. Besides all the bullshit I'm going to talk about, and besides anything anyone's going to talk about, like, do what you want to do. And these are all just yeah. Number one thing, do what you want to do. All this, it's like, these are techniques that I've identified with. Russell's going to talk about things he's identified with it, but you know, take it apart. Like, you form your own opinions and do whatever you do in any programming language. It's all up for game. But that is an image of Xenakis, Yanis Xenakis, a highly influential computer musician from very, very first stages of computers in general. Yeah. Okay, so the real-time performance environment. I call this the scene. It is a scene created by the composer, performers, anyone who adds to the shaping of the general performance environment. And I think these are defined by relationships and gestures, movements and actions, and ways to like measure this information, measure the information of a gesture, bias that in such a way that can help you add compositional elements to your real-time performance. So musical output defined by performance relationships in an ecological system, action as sound, and sound as an object, and how these are unified within the scope of the real-time system, how you can utilize those to really develop different relationships and methods. Scene analysis. That is a term, I'm not sure who originally started talking about it, but I learned about it from Albert S. Bregman and his text, Auditory Scene Analysis. It covers the idea of auditory perception, the ecological environment, how really the two, let me start with this quote. Only by being aware of how sound is created and shaped in the world, we can use it to derive the properties of sound-producing events around us. So there's two big variables here. It's how we perceive it and how it's shaped. When you create a feedback network to take information from both sides and use that as a compositional element. Composing the scene. The development of electroacoustic resources, composers have the ability, blah, 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 to have all this shit going on. The creative and basically you can creatively bias this link between the objects, the movement through space, and the way you perceive them. And you can refer to this as an ecological system, ecological meaning that it's procedural in some way, and an abstract mapping process rather than a direct, oh, I do this, and this does that. It could be a lot more like an influential process. Like you influence the real-time system in such a way to, rather than tell it to do something discrete. So performance relationships through time, and real-time system can help develop intricate relationships. That is just a simple graphic, really obvious, but just thinking about where does your real-time systems sit within this graphic? What are we looking at? And I think it's arguable to look at all of them, or you could use this system as a metaphor when building your real-time system. Let's say you have sound files to represent your long-term memory. Those aren't necessarily going to be conscious, but you can call those, that long-term memory, those sound files, in a way that is influenced by the human brain and the way that we actually interact with things. And I think you can get some really interesting results when you just kind of try to define a real-time system to somewhat of a natural process that already happens, that is already based on the way we experience the world. And motor processor, I think that is a really important part of it. Like, it's not like you're necessarily interacting with all your performances, but I think the inherently music and motion are very very linked and dependent on each other. And whether or not people are interacting or responding to the environment, it's that motor processor is still affecting the way that they're perceiving the performance. Okay, pattern of acoustic energy perceived by ear is a mixture of the effects of the different events. So I think that quote really simple, but it explains how the real-time system is this mixture. It's the effects and the events that are unified and perceived in this scene, in this environment that you're creating. And when associating metaphors to this scene, this projection of sound, you can, once again, go back to the memory thing, go back to the way we, as humans, familiarize ourselves with an experience. And through the development of that experience, you can take that gesture, that content, and apply it to other elements, or dramatically decay it in such a way that we as humans can identify with, and you can use it as a metaphor in a way to associate various emotions and metaphors with the sound and the objects and all the elements of the performance scene. And this graphic is based off of this Gestalt psychology, and I think it really helped me think about representing, like, I know it's visual, but like, how would you represent that phenomena in audio? And that's a question I kind of always ask myself. How do I represent this thing that is so visually intriguing, but with inside an audio system? Movement and space. How do you establish relationship between the gestures, textures, and space? That's how we live our lives, after all. Through action and performance action. It can be subtle, it can be dramatic, but I think action is the key here. It's the performer's link to the material. Music is movement. The statement does not only refer to physical movement of sound waves, but also the fact that we create music by moving, and we perceive music while moving. So with this in mind, how do we develop a system that is procedural in a way that it is its own entity, but we can also interact with it, reach our hands in it and change something or influence it in some way? It doesn't have to be, it could be more passive than active, it could be more active than passive, but I think just putting yourself in a position to influence your system is, it's hard finding a balance between that. And I think the idea of motion and the way that we interact with our material is really something to think about. Making the connections. Gesture, electroacoustic works can be creatively biased in the mapping process. Mapping, I'm sure everyone's familiar with it. It's just the idea of taking incoming parameters and mapping them, or user input and interaction, and mapping them to some sort of function, or using them as variables in your program. And real-time system is basically just a network of these mapped parameters. And we have two types of mapping in real-time systems for electronic music. One-to-one linear mapping. I change this knob, and it changes the frequency. It changes the low-cut filter, or whatever. It's clearly defined. It's not ambiguous. It's very obvious what it is. And then there's abstract mapping, which is more procedural. It's a complex relationship. It's something, like I was saying, how you can influence the system rather than control it, like discretely. So here are a couple of graphics that I hope make sense to you. This top one is, it's not a timeline, it's just a synthesizer with parameters like frequency, amplitude, LFO, bottom out, whatever. The input from the control system is just directly one-to-one related. This does that, this does that, this does that. And on a timeline, musical timeline, x-axis is the movement through time. Let's say this is 10 seconds. So at second 2.5, you have this gesture, because strict musical timeline happens there. And that is spread across the timeline, one-to-one, direct. This is abstract mapping. This is a previous one with the synthesizer example that I showed you. But this is just an example of something that, or a functional way to interact with this on more of an influential level. Like you have an input, a control system, something that you're putting into it, and half of that information is going to a delay line, so it's creating multiple taps in time to trigger something. And then you also have a compare function, on and off. Is this gate on? Is it off? What is it letting through something? Whatever. You can multiply those values, that on and off, with the delay lines to create an amplitude envelope for, let's say, a resynthesizer. So you can take the same information, but make it much more complex and unpredictable. And this is on the timeline. As you saw before, it was all one-to-one and direct. You can take gesture information and spread that across the timeline and use that as a recurring theme, a metaphor, an element that is much more abstract than just happening once. And I think a lot about composition is creating and demonstrating these themes, this idea, this creative constraint. And I think spreading that through time, elongating it, and representing it in different ways is really important to creating a truly composed system. And finding a balance between the one-to-one mapping, the abstract mapping, and your relationship with the sound objects through your actions. It's if it's too abstract, it will be perceived purely as procedural. What is this person actually doing? I don't get it. Or if it's too direct, if there's too much one-to-one, it's transparent, it's tedious to look through, it's boring. Like, okay, I know that does that. He's just changing the low cut, that's it. So I think creating an interesting performance is, and for the context of the project, it always changes. But for an interesting performance, you're always trying to find a balance between what is procedural and what is aesthetic. How to make it less transparent, but still engaging and still gestural. In practice, making these considerations, as the composer proves new, conforming results. This is why I care about it. I find myself making the most interesting things when I don't know what's really going on. Like, it's one thing to really imagine something in your head. I want this bass line, I want this drum beat, I want this relationship. I think it's good to give some of that, some of those actions, you use those as an input to a real-time system to develop something much more complicated and allow yourself to have the freedom, like, just treat it as a black box and just throw new things at it. And you develop a unique ecology. Like, you really can develop these things that you never would have intended. And I think when you're in this practice, you can really utilize your toolkit to develop an environment that is much bigger and much more abstract than anything you could actually think of consciously. And on this, I want to end on this quote. An important part of building representation is to decide which parts of the sensory stimulation are telling us about the same environmental object or event. Unless we put the right combination of sensory evidence together, we will not be able to recognize what is going on. So that ties into the idea of finding a balance and using procedural and direct aesthetics to create your system. And here are the references that I thought were very beneficial to me. I don't know if anyone's interested. Auditory scene analysis, action sound, developing methods in terms of blah, 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 thesis on liveness, and Simon Emerson. Pretty much anything that guy's ever done is just brilliant. Yeah, if anyone's interested, I could give them most of these PDFs if they would like. And I have a little thing in Super Collider. I know a few people have used Super Collider. Yeah, anyone? Yeah. Well, anyway, Super Collider is a real-time audio synthesis environment, and I think just by using it, I have really developed a new way of thinking about my material and interacting with it. Yeah, I have a few synthesizers here. Russell and Russell's the next speaker. We're both going to be performing tonight. After his talk, I'm going to be using this plus a couple other pieces of gear, and he's going to be performing what he's talking about. So hopefully the practice will show. But I guess this is somewhat similar to Faust in a way. I don't know enough about really Faust to be qualified to say that or not. But here in this patch, actually. No, basically, these are all unit generators, and they're all nested. So you can have all these different, like sine waves or saw waves, or different, more unique generators to take your input signal and map it to something procedural, or to the mouse position, mouse Y, mouse X. And one of the things I like doing is taking, for specifically Super Collider, and when mapping parameters from my X and Y, take the mouse X and map that to something more discrete, like frequency. Take mouse Y and map that to something a little more abstract. So just on that X and Y coordinate, you have abstract processes and direct one-to-one processes. Let's see, my server. Are we good?
Yeah, do we have anything to demo?
Yeah,
because we're getting a weird background.
And this also has it's fairly unpredictable, but that's what I really like about it.
Do you know what that background noise is?
I think we're actually. Let's see. This is like, I don't know, under 10 lines of code, and just the amount of like just nesting that you can do with that, reusing variables is, I find it really beautiful and efficient and unmatched. So really subtle movements, you really get a lot out of them. Playing it right. Anyways, that's Super Collider, and that's what I'm performing with tonight. And I think that'll do it. Thanks.
Any questions, guys?
Oh yeah, questions. Yeah.
Okay, so obviously what you seem to be trying to do with the great beauty of electronic music is that you can get away from the direct one-to-one mapping of gestures and actions such as plucking a string and creating a sound from that. But what do you think it's going to do to the performer-audience interaction if we can no longer see, oh, he's fiddling with buttons and because this is a valid complaint a lot of people have about even DJs who are putting tracks on.
Definitely.
Oh, they're just playing with buttons, and I can't see them actually playing with an instrument. It's not real music, etc., etc. What do you think that's the future of the audience performer interaction is going to look like in a world where
I think it's not really going to be one way or the other. Honestly, I think being 2014 and like treating the computer as an instrument, it's about fucking time that the audience becomes more intelligent about what a performer can do just with their mouse X and mouse Y. And I think that has been inherent to any instrument that is already all over the place. It's like, I don't know, someone playing the, God, what's it called? The theremin. It's like, when that first came out, no one probably had any idea how it worked. Just some guy moving his hands, and it didn't. And I think with any instrument that, like Simon Emerson, part of that that text that I referenced, his whole thing is that it's present, it's there. People that don't understand the instrument can't identify with it as much as the other people. But should that really be a deterrent? And a lot of that comes down to the sincerity of the performer. Like if they're willing to just play, like press play and do something, I think it shows in the music, and I think it shows in the real-time environment. You just know if it's real-time or not, if it's preconceived or not, because it's procedural, and you can tell by the way that the performer is interacting with it. But that is definitely a gray area, though. And my personal opinion is that people need to become more audiences in general. I think Edinburgh is really fucking good at that, but like back in the States at least, it's not the same. But yeah, I mean, it's just, if there's a composer doing their set and they're just staring at a computer screen the whole time, why is that not as valid as, I don't know, Steve Vai or whatever? It's like, it's not about virtuosity. It can be about, it's like close your eyes and listen to it. Like hear the gestures through the real-time environment. That's really my argument. But a lot of people like to integrate like guitars or I mean, I play the piano and have my real-time synthesis going on at the same time. So I think it's really up to the performer to be a little more creative, as well as it's up to the audience to respect that the computer can be treated as an instrument.
But surely there is a need for some sort of visual representation. I mean, you say with a theremin, it's an electronic instrument, but people can still see hands moving, and there's something physical about that. People can understand that. And so is there maybe room for doing something like what Francisco's doing?
Exactly.
And adding in more visualization that's not directly tied to the music.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you're making music out of dancing or drawing and making music and playing interesting.
Yeah, with tools like you built, like that gives composers, people like us, new ways, we have new methods of realizing new relationships, you know, and I think, I mean, just give me more, you know, like we want more, and let's take advantage of it. Yes.
Well, that was pretty much what I wanted to ask, and I do have a bit of a follow-up on what you said here. Like, I feel like there is one kind of piece missing in that. You mentioned a lot about abstracting the controls of the composer to the actual effects, so to kind of make it more ambiguous or to make it a little more unpredictable. And I think about what Ben was saying about there's a large cultural rejection towards a heavy use of automation and technology within performance, which is understandable in some way. But I agree with you, there kind of, in my opinion, needs to be some kind of cultural change to understand that there's still a lot going on there. But I do feel that there is a little bit of a trade-off between your idea of abstraction and ambiguity and actual control and actual performance or live, control.
Interaction.
I mean, if you had a guitar, for example, and you were plugged into an effect like this, it's a little less predictable. I think people would be more eager to accept that because they can see what's going on.
Definitely. But and I think with that point, it's really contextual to what exactly is the performance outside of the computer. Like what are you using? Like guitar, piano. Like I think defining like once you have a context, working within that context, working within those tools, I think you can really abstract the right amount of direct relationships as well as abstract relationships. And it's all about the balance. And I mean, I still struggle with that. I think that's just the beauty of composing real-time systems. It's like there's always new relationships and new balances that you can find within the same material.
So there's a bit of like, if something happens that you weren't necessarily expecting in your composition, then you can kind of, how you react to it is part of the beauty of the performance.
Well, as primarily an improv musician, I treat it as just an event that you can like try to recreate it or try to influence it in some way to happen again and use it just as, because as an improv musician, you're constantly like dealing with all these things that happen that you don't really know what to do with. And just if you know your system well enough, you can probably recreate it or influence it to expand upon that, that new idea that it's produced for you. Yeah, no, and like I said before, like, do whatever the fuck you want. Like, this is not, like, these are just the techniques that I find useful, that I have really identified with, and help me think a little bit more objectively about the audience's perspective. Yeah. Timo?
I guess I have a question more for the audience than not for you. But welcome to chime in. But going back to that conversation about using more traditional instrumentation in terms of performance, I use the guitars and bass guitars and run it through effects and systems that I've built. But there's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship between, you know, this is a bass guitar sound and that's what you're hearing. It's like I'm using the bass guitar, transferring that to data, and then remapping that data. Do you think there's any more viability in doing that than using a mouse pad? And if so, like, to what extent would that be?
Is that directed to me?
Well, it's to the crowd. I mean, I'm doing my paper on it, so whatever you guys have to say. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer.
If I can answer, I mean, I would say that I wasn't trying to devalue the use of software, heavy use of software and automation. I was more kind of hinting at the fact that it's less difficult, it's less easy or more difficult for the audience to feel involved with the act if they can't really see or understand what's going on.
I agree with you on that.
And I think a lot of this has to do with what kind of performance environment it is. Because there's a lot of music, like DJs and stuff, I consider that recreational. People want to dance, people want to. Whereas in the academic community, there's a lot of like, it's more about like the technical side and how these processes can influence the restructuralist culture in a way. It's like the stylism and the traditionalism, which is recreational and ritualistic, which I think it's really important to have some sort of virtuosic quality, like a guitar player who can fucking shred. Like that is, on a recreational level, that is awesome, in my opinion. But as far as the display of technology goes, I think using, like a lot of people are more open to like closing their eyes and really using their ears to find the relationships that the composer is putting into their piece. If that makes any sense.
In a sense, a computer is not just a mouse. It's
Yeah.
an input output, so there's cameras attached to necks.
Yeah.
Quite a lot to exploit there. I don't know if it answered your question. Have you heard of Mind Tunes?
Who?
Mind Tunes.
No, I don't think so.
No, it's a project that, funnily enough, Smirnoff came up with it. And they did it in conjunction with one of, I think it was University of Paris, I can't remember what university it was. The guy ahead of it had quite an interesting degree background. He did a PhD in science and arts. That was the title of the PhD, quite broad. Basically what they did is they put a bunch of headsets on people who were disabled, and they were perfect in terms of mind and cognition. They were fine, and their disabilities were physical, really strong physical disabilities. So they could not play instruments. Okay, so they mapped all these. They put all these headsets on them that did a lot of gestural recognition in terms of their face. Yeah, they measured potentials. You can measure potentials in the head. They composed music. Yeah, it was coordinated by in terms of the music side of it, was by DJ Fresh. And the music was really intense. It was amazing. Like you can't see them performing; they can hardly move.
Right.
You know, you're not going to see them being like, or playing a guitar, or not even touching a mouse, because some of them can.
Right.
But like you could feel that there was something coming out of that music, you know, and it was definitely tuned for clubs as well,
Right.
because you just feel it basically. It was fantastic. Yeah.
We have a colleague who does muscle mapping, essentially by putting microphones, different sensors on different parts of his body, and he controls everything by just, you know, flexing different muscles. And he's got really intense performance as well. Then, you know, he's got all this sound mapped to him. But the thing is, that's interesting for me, goes back to more like that traditional instrumentation, and I get it because I'm somewhere in between being academic and being mainstream in my own performance, where, you know, the result of what the crowd can connect to is an important part of my performance, whereas in academic performances you have a lot more flexibility in terms of, you know, gesture and what that means and that type of flexibility. But when you're somewhere in this border zone, you know, if you use a bass guitar and I make a gesture, but it doesn't make a gesture that they really recognize, it becomes some other type of thing. I've struggled with the idea of, is that any different than any other controller? Because essentially this has just become a different controller for making the sound. I could use anything. I could use a contact mic, I could use, my voice. But that context, that relationship between this type of traditional instrument, which is kind of gained a lot more validity in mainstream music, being brought into the context of more abstract electronic music, is that justified? Is that novelty? Or what exactly is that? And I guess that's the thing that I'm trying to investigate in my own research.
So it's a great conversation. I think we're going to have to end it there and move on to the next one just for the sake of time. But great presentation. Thank you very much.